Well, I'd say the first thing about being a woman in the 1970s, and I started here in 1968, was that it initially was very lonely. There were not very many women faculty members when I joined the faculty. The English department, which had 55 tenure-track faculty members at that time, had 2 women on tenure track, myself being one of them, and the other one being Bernice Sloat, who was the editor of the Prairie Schooner and a full professor. And one of the things that was interesting about the 70s is that we moved from that kind of situation where 2 women out of 55 and no courses on women's anything. By 1975, 76, we were creating a major in women's studies. Our department had hired some more women. Several other departments had hired a woman or 2. And the women now all knew each other and were working together. Many of them were working together to put together a curriculum in women's studies. And so it was a very exciting and stressful time in some ways, because the work that we did, and it started as early as 1970, 71, the work we did was not really very accepted by our colleagues at the time. And I look back on my young self doing that, because I was only, I think, 26 when I started at the university as an assistant professor right out of graduate school at Emory. And I look back and I think, why wasn't I terrified about getting tenure? But I don't remember ever thinking about that, really. Later, when tenure got to be much harder, I think it was very intimidating to young women being highly visible as an activist. But when I started in 68, 69, I just didn't think about it. And I think a lot of the other women in the 1970s had a sense that time and history were on our side, and we were not, I think, afraid, although there were women that worked with us who ran into problems in their department. And, so it wasn't without some peril, but I don't remember fear being one of the aspects of it. Let me tell you some of the early things that we did so that the concreteness of the historical record can show through. I was reviewing some of the papers that I have in these files, and I find that as early as 1970, there was an organized Women's Rights Committee. It was a subcommittee of the Human Rights Committee of the Faculty Senate at that time. And Professor Paul Olson was chair of the Human Rights Committee, and he asked me to chair the Women's Rights Committee. It was the first committee of any sort that had been organized on our campus to look into anything relevant to women. And we did several studies which we then reported to the Faculty Senate. And the first one was on salary inequities with the clerical staff. That seemed to be a more pressing problem that affected a great many women. One of the difficulties of not having very many women in the faculty was that it was hard to statistically show a pattern of discrimination if you didn't have more people in the pattern. But there were 1,000 clerical workers and women in other categories working in the university, and even more, I guess, in the whole university system, which was under the regulations of the state personnel system. And so we looked into their wages, and one of the ways we went about showing that, obviously the wages were low, but we had to show discrimination to get anywhere. And we found that there were a few categories that were in the clerical categories, job categories under clerical, that had men in them. For example, postal office workers in the university post office. And everywhere that we found men in that in any clerical classification, they made more than the women. So we wrote a report on that and went to the faculty senate with it. And there were members of the faculty senate who stood up and argued with us about this. And I remember one who became a very prominent person on our campus that I won't mention because things change and he changed, who argued that all this showed was that women would work for less than men. And I remember standing there and saying, no, it proves one other thing, that men will pay us less for our work. One of the outcomes of that study was the creation of some new classifications within this clerical system so that women could be moved into other, they could get promoted into a new classification. We had, for example, I think 3 women who were running branch libraries of the university. One in chemistry, you know, there are several branch libraries around the campus, with a clerical classification. And it was easier to target that kind of position because we could draw a comparable study of what that position was paying in the main library, and the main library was not being run by people with clerical classifications by any means. They were faculty appointments. The librarians on this campus have historically been faculty appointments, but clerical staff were running the branch libraries. And that did change. We got that change. So that goes back to 70, 71, 72, 73. And our primary emphasis in those early days was on pay equity and job equity. That was nationally what was getting a lot of attention. And in many ways, that was the thing that needed the most attention the worst, because the wages were really low. And there were clear patterns of discrimination. So that was what we first concentrated on. Then in the 70s, the early 70s, there were a lot of things happening on the campus. We were still having Vietnam protests. We still had things like the incursion into Cambodia. And there was, for example, an entire week of strike classes at UNL. Not everybody held strike classes, but a great many faculty did. Right, and that happened the week after the Kent State shootings. And coming out of all of that student activism on campuses in 71, 74 period, we began to have women students demanding the study of women, which was a great asset to those of us on the faculty who had these concerns. And without the strong support of the women students who got involved in this, we would not have been as successful as we were in establishing a women's studies program. But we had students who would circulate petitions and say, we want courses in women's literature, we want courses in women's history. And so a lot of our attention then turned to creating a curriculum, because there was no curriculum. The first course having to do with women was actually taught in what was then the home economics department. We don't call it home economics anymore. That's one of the changes that the feminist movement brought. But there were some very interesting and committed women over there. And the first course on this campus was taught in home ec. Then the women faculty in arts and sciences started to pull together a curriculum. And I know in my own department, I created the first 2 courses on women in literature. One was called just Women in Literature, and the other one was, I think, Southern women writers. And I picked that because I had graduated from a Southern institution and knew those writers. And one of the handicaps we had as faculty in creating a women's curriculum is that none of us had been educated in a women's curriculum. And I think about the only two women authors that showed up with any frequency in the English curriculums across the United States were Emily Dickinson in the U.S. and George Eliot in England. And besides those two, we had not been educated in it. And so I never actually taught the Southern Women in Southern Literature class. Another person taught it who took a great interest in it. Eventually that course died as we developed other courses. And we now have, I think, probably on the books about a dozen courses in women in literature, feminist theory, and lesbian literature, all kinds of things that have with just women in literature.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? We started with women in literature?
We started with women in literature because we had to scramble around to put together a study of enough women in literature to fill the semester, you know, and library resources were not great. There were not a lot of textbooks. I published an essay in one of the first books that was ever published called Images of Women in Literature. And we started with images of women in literature. Nobody would do that now in their scholarship. It's enormously passé now. But when we started doing it in the early 70s, it was where you started. And then about 1974, we thought we should have a major in women's studies. And there was a group of about 8 of us that were an ad hoc committee that worked on that. One of the people who had been very active in the feminist studies that were beginning, both in the curriculum and with us as women faculty getting together and talking about things, was a woman in the philosophy department named Sarah Hoagland. Sarah Hoagland was one of the people that ran into problems in her department, where I believe she was the only woman. But Sarah had started reading groups, a reading group, and we were reading philosophers, and there wasn't a feminist philosophy to read, but we were reading philosophers to see what they said about women, and she was leading that. And she was also very active in the group that was trying to organize women's studies. And Anne Climola, who was a professor of history, was very active in it. We wanted Anne to do a course on women in American history, which we did create. We had to create several new courses to flesh out this major. And it took a couple of years of actually working on the major and then processing it through all the committees. But I think by 75, 76, we did have it approved. It now stands as one of the oldest women's studies programs in the United States because we were pretty early in the game to have a full major. Not a lot of universities were able to get a full major. At the same time we were doing all that, we had these ongoing concerns about salary and promotion equity. And one of the things that came up that I think has probably been lost from memory to anyone who wasn't part of it was the gender integration of the UNO marching band. Up until 1971, the marching band was all male. And our Women's Rights Committee had by this time evolved into the first Chancellor's Commission on the Status of Women, and I was the first chair of that. We had made a recommendation to the Chancellor that he should appoint us as a Chancellor's Commission and get us out from being a subcommittee of a Senate committee. And he had agreed. I don't think at the time he had enthusiastically agreed, because I'll always remember him saying, "Why should I do that?" But we had good enough reasons, and it was happening all around the country too. And so women students in the music department actually brought this to our attention, that they were not allowed to be in the marching band. And as it turned out, most of the bands in the Big Eight at that time had already done gender integration. I think there were one or two that had not. And we call the band director, a man named Jack Snyder, and we tried to talk to him about why women weren't in the band, and he was pretty adamant not wanting women in the band. And we ultimately had him, and I think perhaps it was the chair of the music department, I'm not sure, but anyway, we had them come to a commission meeting, and we asked them a lot of questions about this. And I have a memo that we sent as a follow-up on that, summarizing their arguments about it. And the first one was that band uniforms cost $150 a piece, and they didn't have any that would fit women. Another one was that women don't really become band directors. They get married and have kids. It's really so far out of the range of things that you would think anybody could even think these days. The one that I always remember best, the reason that seemed to me to be the weakest of all, I guess, was that a good marching band requires uniformity of gait, and women cannot keep straight lines. And we asked, why can't women create straight lines? And the answer was, they have these curvy bodies. And so, this, if it hadn't been real, you would have thought it was the theater of the absurd. And it turned out that Bob Devaney, who was the athletic director, apparently controlled an awful lot of the funding, if not all of the funding, of the marching band. So I called up Bob Devaney, and I said, Coach Devaney, this is the heyday of Bob Devaney, you know. And I said, Coach Devaney, we think that the university is going to wind up being very embarrassed in the Big Eight if something's not done about this. I said, we're about only one of maybe two marching bands that still won't let women in. And with these new legislative directives to protect women, this is going to be a problem for us and an embarrassment. And he said, I don't care if women are in the band. And I said, tell them that. And apparently he did. And the next year, women were in the marching band. They were allowed to try out with the men by playing. I believe there was a screen so that the panel making decisions couldn't see who it was. And so there's probably not 5% of this population still around that even remembers this. But yes, we integrated the marching band, among other things.
That is a great story. It's incredible.
Well, as I said, if you hadn't been living through it and heard that interview, you would have thought somebody was writing a satiric play or a skit for Saturday Night Live or something. But that was true. And finding the memo when I was reviewing some of the papers, because this, you know, we're talking about 40 and 45 years ago almost on some of this. And I came across that memo that was sent as a follow-up. It was sent to to the director of the School of Music at the time. So it was our official report. So we continued to do those kinds of things. And we continued to look into salary inequities, and we went back into the library with concerns about pay inequities there. And there was a follow-up on that. We did salary studies of women faculty, and almost every year for about 10 years, either the Women's Rights Committee or the Chancellor's Commission on the Status of Women did some kind of special report targeting some problem. It was often with clerical staff. I think we all felt an obligation to try to do things that affected the largest group of female employees on the campus, because although there were some severe cases of women faculty being discriminated against in ways that seriously harmed their careers, we were in many ways in a relatively preferential situation. You know, we had our professorial rank, and in a university that's a huge difference. And many of us by this time now had tenure. And there were still, at that time, very few women professors. I think we had one woman administrator, Virginia Trotter, I think was her name, and she was later part of she was I think an assistant or associate or an undersecretary of something in some Republican administration. I've forgotten now which one. Might have been Nixon's, but I don't remember now. Could have been Gerald Ford's, I don't know now. But aside from Virginia, there were not very many women in any kind of position of chair or dean. There was a woman chair of home ec, but not very many, and still not very many at that time in arts and sciences, and probably none in engineering at that time. And so we continued to have pressure for affirmative action, as other institutions did. What was happening nationally was also often a great asset to us. The university used to have a nepotism rule, for example. And the rule went that only one person in a family could have tenure. We did a case study of 30 cases of nepotism in the university system. At that time it included UNO, UNL, and UNMC. And we knew nepotism.
Sorry, could you start with we knew and we identified 30 cases?
We knew of and were able to identify 30 cases of nepotism in the university. And in every case, it was the woman who didn't have tenure. The husband would have tenure. There were 2 cases in our own Department of English of women whose husbands were tenured chairs of their department, physics and psychology. And the women had been teaching in our department for 5 years in one case, and I think 7 in another case. But they were teaching as instructors. And Peter McGraw was, I believe, our Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the time. He later became a very, very prominent person in higher education administration. And we went to Peter, and I've known him for years since in these other roles, but we went to Peter with the evidence that in 30 cases of nepotism, the party that was not allowed to have tenure was the woman. And I believe it was the University of Michigan that had just lost a lawsuit on this issue. trying to defend nepotism. And we brought the information to him about that lawsuit. And he agreed with us that this was a bad rule. And I think it was through his work up above that rule was changed in the Board of Regents bylaws. And the two women in our department were then moved on to tenure track lines. I thought they should have been given tenure because they had by this time both been here more than the 7 years that the AAP rules had used. But the university wouldn't go as far as to give these women who had been teaching here all those years tenure. But they did put many of them on a tenure track line. And I'm happy to say those two women went on to get tenure in a fairly prompt way and published and were distinguished members of our department. And so one of the things, when you look back on it, there have been actually quite a few changes. I know that almost none of the women faculty who are probably under 60 even know any of this, and would be shocked to discover that today, when we work hard to have dual career options for young faculty, that if they and their husbands, and it was husbands, had been hired in the 1960s and 70s, that they would have not even been eligible to get it under those nepotism rules. So things do change. You know, they don't perhaps change as fast as you'd like, and certainly not as painlessly as you would like, but they do change. And there's been a lot of change at this university. I have come out of that experience of many, many years now, thinking that one of the major good fortunes of this university, and particularly of the UNL campus, which until my years as systems officer was by far the campus I knew the best, that we've been blessed with having basically very good administrators, administrators who were concerned about people's welfare and had academic backgrounds themselves. That's one of the things that's changing in higher education that worries me, is that so many administrators that are no longer coming out of the faculty and don't have academic backgrounds don't actually understand the life of the faculty and have very little sympathy with that. But we had good administrators. We were able, through the work of many people, not just the women activists, but people like Jim McShane, for example, we were able to draft really good bylaws. And that's been a blessing to this campus, to have basically good bylaws and to have administrators who wanted to run an ethical and fair university and university system.
I was wondering if when you think back about the program, do you remember many intersections with the community? Were there any sorts of attempts to outreach or to work with community members?
There were quite a few. There were one of the first groups that we tried to work with and outreach were other campuses. And we had quite a few interchanges with UNO. They were behind us in developing their program, and they went for several years with a minor in women's studies before they were in a position to do a major. I'm not actually certain where they stand now on that. I think they have an active program now. I know they have an active program now, I'm just not sure how large it is now. So we did a lot of outreach to other women faculty in Nebraska, but we had faculty members who worked with prisoners And we had, eventually, as part of Women's Studies, we had an internship program where women could work in, say, the Rape Crisis Center, and other kinds of things like that. Because I always lived in Omaha, I probably know less about the outreach in Lincoln than some of the others, and you might ask some of the others about that. Once Women's Studies was organized, I think off and on for years I was on the steering committee, and I certainly taught some courses in it. Then my own life got caught up in being graduate chair of our program, and then being vice president, then president of National AAUP, and coming out of that being chair of the Department of English for 10 years. And I wasn't teaching nearly as much, and by this time we had hired quite a few women, and I think half our department, or maybe slightly more than half now, is female. And I was the first woman chair of the department, I believe, certainly in my memory. I don't believe that Louise Pound was ever chair of the department. She was a famous person who was a part of our department and who did become, I believe, the first woman president of the MLA. But I think that I was the first woman chair of the English department. And when I was interim dean, I believe I was the first woman dean of arts and sciences. And then I was the first woman executive vice president provost.
Did you encounter discrimination because of your gender in these leadership positions?
Occasionally, but not as much as I think most people think that I would. The first administrative role I ever had was half-time, and it was when I was graduate chair in the English department. And I actually ran into more problems there because the men in my department, frankly, were not used to having a woman officer tell them anything. I mean, it just hadn't happened before. And I remember 2 or 3 men that were just, they would fly off the handle and a disproportionate amount of anger about a teaching assignment that they imagined I'd given them or something. When in fact I did not make teaching assignments. The chair always has made the teaching assignments, not the vice chair or the graduate chair. And so every once in a while there would be some male colleague who was a friend of mine that would fly off in anger about something that I could only feel was some level of irritation at something happening in their career that they didn't like, and thinking that a woman must have had a hand in it or something. Now, I'm not saying that I was always the easiest colleague either, but I did genuinely like all my male colleagues, and so I did not have problems dealing with them as male colleagues. And there were feminists who really had a good bit of antagonism towards men in those days, and I think that men were not outside a reasonable expectation that there might be some hostility coming towards them. Some of them were quite resistant to change. I remember being on a subcommittee that was trying to revise the PhD reading list in American Lit. And of course I was the only woman on that committee, and the only woman I think at that time in American Lit. And I was trying to get them to put someone other than Emily Dickinson and Willa Cather on the reading list for American Lit, and I was suggesting that we put Kate Chopin, The Awakening, which had been, quote, by this time discovered, and everybody was reading it. And it was a wonderful book, and it was an eye-opener for a lot of people to read it. And I remember one of my male colleagues arguing against putting Kate Chopin on there, and part of his argument was, well, we'd have to take a man off. And I suggested they drop Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage, and because Chopin and Stephen Crane overlapped in time, and you could use Kate Chopin to talk about American naturalism and other kinds of things that we also use Stephen Crane to talk about, and that was considered just an outrageous suggestion. They added Chopin at the end of this hassle, but they did not take Stephen Crane off. They just added. And I think that's one of the things that happens often in curriculum, and not just with women's studies, with all ethnic studies, and now perhaps with international studies, we just add. And this is one of the reasons that the degree soon wound up being more than 120 hours, and it was taking students 5 years to complete it, because there was such resistance to changing the curriculum, and the change that people were willing to make was usually add, not rebalance. And ultimately you have got to rebalance, because you do really still have to get these kids in and out in a reasonable amount of time. And you can't teach them everything anyway.
Well, I'm wondering also then, thinking about these students, maybe not just students but kids and young people in the community, given your experience and your observations, what advice would you give them? Is there anything that you would want young people to know in particular based on your activist for women's rights?
I guess I would like for the young women to have a little bit more historical understanding of what it was like, even in the professional lifetime of their mothers and their professors. One of the disadvantages of being young is you don't have much experience. And so the world you know has a very short lifespan. And the things that I think have been perhaps most important in the 20th century and into the 21st century of the United States happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's when you have the civil rights movement, that's when you have the feminist movement, that's when you have the Vietnam War. And those events were culturally altering events in a way that some of the trends today are not. I'm not saying that we're not making many changes, we are. But to be able to experience certain large social movements, there's nothing about the way people feel about the current wars that's anywhere like the equivalent of what happened in this country during the Vietnam War. Even with the immigration issues right now, there's nothing there equivalent to intensity culturally, like the civil rights movement in the 60s. I wish there were, because then I think those movements would move faster towards a good resolution. But I think a lot of young students today don't know what it feels like to be caught up in some kind of important social movement that you know, even as you're doing it, that this is going to change things. First of all, it's going to change you. It's going to change you forever. But you see it changing everyone in your generation and beyond your generation. And So part of me would say, learn a little more history, and think about how within your grandparents' lifetime, they had separate water fountains for blacks and whites in the South, and Rosa Parks couldn't ride on a white bus and sit at the front, you know, all kinds of things like that. It's unthinkable today. You know. The other thing that I would say is, I wish for them a kind of social commitment that a lot of us felt. I came into the women's rights movement out of the civil rights movement because I had grown up in the South and had gone to graduate school in Atlanta, Georgia, at the time that Martin Luther King was head of SCLC. And the year I left Atlanta was the year that he was assassinated and that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And I think that we knew a sense of involvement and commitment and camaraderie with other people working in those movements that has been hard for young people to find in their own lives. And I think a lot of them would like something like that. I have had students tell me that they wished they had something like that in their lives. And I think it's much harder for them to experience those deep bonds that come out of a social movement, because the social movements are not as gripping. There really isn't a comparable thing to being linked arm in arm in a march or a struggle to having a lot of friends on Facebook. Really, they're not going to mean a comparable kind of bond for you. And that kind of passionate intensity, to quote a famous poet whom I love, that kind of passionate intensity is a life-changing thing.